You are listening to Build What's Next, Digital Product Perspectives. I'm your host, Josh Lucas, and at Method, our vision is to connect technology with humanity for a simpler digital future. Join us as we speak with leading experts to discuss industry trends, best practices, and emerging technology that can help you and your organization craft better digital products and experiences.
Welcome back, everybody, to a new episode of Build What's Next. I'm stepping in to host this week for our normal host, Josh Lucas. Really excited about the topic that we're bringing you guys this week. With a lot of the focus over the last couple of years on distributed architectures and now API as a product, I had a chance to meet Jeff Nibler, who I'll let introduce himself in a minute. But he and I sat next to each other at a product dinner, and as an introvert myself, I ended up only talking to one person, going deep on one topic all night. And I said, I think the experiences that Jeff's had would be really interesting for a broader group to talk about. So today we're going to be tackling the changing needs of API developer portals in the enterprise, and specifically how that ties to the developer experience, the product manager experience, and how organizations can operationalize this construct. I've also got Michael Gray, who is our head of architecture and engineering at Method as well, to bring in that perspective of, as an architect, as an engineer, when you're working with a company's APIs and you're going through that portal, what are you looking for? But then also, as we've done work helping companies with their platform selection and building API developer portals, how we help there. So real quick, Jeff, if you don't mind giving a quick background, and I think especially being on the consulting side of APIs as well as being on the enterprise sides, and just going through that a little bit of history. Start us off there.
Sure. So I've been involved with APIs in some way, shape, or form for over 20 years. I originally came up as an engineer building dynamic web applications and was really drawn to APIs. So I pivoted from dynamic web applications to APIs. Back in those days, it was SOAP APIs and XML, and then REST came out from there. So I began getting involved in that and in both SOAP and REST APIs. That was around 12 years ago that I made that shift. From there, I developed entire end-to-end API programs. So that's everything from building the APIs to governing the APIs to supporting the APIs to having the developer portal to house the APIs and service the customers. I built those out for several enterprises, as well as worked for several years for a consulting firm doing nothing but API management. So same thing, but just consulting for a number of different companies. And also included API security consulting for API gateways.
Awesome. MG, if you'll give us a little bit of your background for those who don't know you, and then I don't know if you have an answer to this. It's a surprise question. Do you remember your first time going into an external API developer portal and trying to use like a third-party API in your engineering history? Give us a little bit of background, and even if you don't have the perfect answer, I'd be curious what you come up with there and when that was.
All right, sounds good. Hello, everyone. Glad to be here. So I'm Michael Gray, head of engineering, as Jason mentioned. By way of background, it's pretty varied. Started out actually in mainframe world, so pretty far away from APIs, but eventually moved to the web and mobile and ultimately cloud. And through that process was really working for product companies, working for consulting companies, implementing, integrating, developing APIs, and then actually moved to, as an entrepreneur, stood up a company where we had to provide APIs for third parties. And so that was just a real eye-opening experience to try to understand the needs of other developers. How do you build your own products? And then how do you then build something that you're supporting third-party developers as well? And so moving away from that, then move back into consulting, which I seem to love, and really helping other companies understand, think about how to deliver, implement, test, support APIs.
And so, MG, can you pinpoint the first time you had to go in to a developer portal as an engineer? You look at someone's documentation or use it? Do you remember?
Wow. I'm not totally sure, but I'm pretty sure it probably was a payment integration.
Okay.
And this was prior to the Braintree and Stripe portals. So you're much more sort of enterprise payment backend. And dare I say it was terse. It was terse, difficult to understand, and the ability to set up an environment and figure out if you got it right, if you know what the error messages meant, proved quite challenging.
Were you working in the payment industry at the time that you were looking for that API?
My product needed to process payments, so I wasn't directly, but in order for our product to be successful, the integration was mandatory. So we were one removed from the payment industry, but that was core to what we needed to integrate for our solution.
And I like that you use the word terse there. And Jeff, I'd be curious, you've talked a little bit about this. There's been a lot that's changed over the last 5 to 7 years in developer portals. I can remember my first project where we were out there and we were mapping the developer journey. We were building the archetypes of different personas of an API consumer, internal versus external, looking at someone at a hackathon needing to use the API versus an internal kind of admin or developer. But I really like how you talk about developer portals, Jeff, because you really focus on the end users here. And so talk to us a little bit about when you think about the moments of truth and the key personas that you're building a developer portal for, and thinking about what MG just said about terse documentation, like in your experiences, like what are those key things that a company really needs to nail? And who are you focusing on telling that story to?
Yeah, all great questions. And it really plugs into what Michael just said. So the number one thing the portal should do is make it easy for the user to find the capability. And the capability is the API. And the reason why I asked the question about the payment industry is that a lot of companies, when they're building APIs, just by default, they think about, well, we're using this ISO XML payment industry standard, and that's great for them. But most customers are not going to be in the finance vertical. So you have to develop it for everybody. And the portal needs to also be easy to understand, easy to find that content. So in terms of moments of truth, discoverability, find what they're looking for without asking for help, because that's going to slow them down. So the DIY component of it, allowing the customer to do as much as possible themselves, ensuring that you have role-based access for each API in terms of what can be seen by the public versus an authenticated user or a user that's been granted permission. And then being able to easily obtain assistance at any time during an integration or following an integration, and that continuous support that lives on afterwards. Those would be the key components.
Yeah. I love that you're talking about discoverability, and I want to look at discoverability for engineers versus discoverability for product managers. Because Jeff, you've talked about, hey, we're also building for the product manager. And personally, you can't do any custom software development without third-party APIs these days. And so almost every situation that we walk into, there's a platform vendor, there's a service provider, there's someone that we're going to have to integrate with. And so it's actually interesting. Like I feel like I can almost see how much risk we're going to have in a project sometimes by going into someone's developer documentation and saying like, is this the nuts and bolts of this? Or are they going to talk to me like a human? And when we've talked to clients before, I've talked about, hey, engineers aren't just engineers, they're entrepreneurs as well. And so they're looking of like, what's going to be valuable for the business case to be able to do this. And then this isn't my quote, MG, this was someone from your team. I'm not going to tell you who they were. But one of our engineers said, hey, engineers were lazy sometimes. Like we want things to be easy. And if we go into your portal and it's impossible to understand what the APIs are, it's impossible to get access. If it takes too long for us to be able to do a tech spike or do a POC and we're going to have to be on the phone and going through a ton of tickets, like it's probably going to hurt your chances of working with us. So MG, I'm curious on your side, when you think about discoverability and the different third-party APIs you've had to develop with over time, like what are you looking for as a developer? And when you don't see something, or when you are seeing something, like what is that saying to you about the potential quality of the API or the experience of what it's going to look like working with that company?
First, to tie it back to what Jeff said, really is discoverability, right? So if I can quickly understand what it is you do, what APIs can I access, what problems are going to help me solve, right? So if I can ascertain that right away quickly, then I can understand, am I in the right place? Is this going to help me try to solve my problem? And then the second thing is, how quickly can I get a sense of how usable this API is, right? So if I think of interactive consoles, or if I think of things that I can actually quickly get into and get a sense of, yes, this is easy to integrate with, this is what the data that's coming back, this is the different formats that I can get, my ability to get hands on keyboard and interact with an API as quickly as possible also is going to help me say, okay, yes, I'm willing to spend more time here, getting in here. And then probably the third thing is, yes, keyboard, but ultimately I'm going to need to spend time in the documentation. So is that well organized? Is that clear? And like you said, Jason, like, does it read like it's written for a human versus a computer? So those are really the first three areas that we tend to look at.
Yeah. And Jeff, I'm curious on your side, but since discoverability is so important, what was the effort? Like, who was in charge of maximizing discoverability as you owned the portal? And like, how much of that was on you? How much of that was on the API owner? How much of that was coaching the engineering team? Like, someone's got to write content. And a lot of times on these projects, it's the same when we do design systems and component libraries. Like, it's project management, it's a lot of documentation, which there's a lot of people that they don't necessarily always see that as a core part of their job. And so talk to me about over 6 years, like, how did you end up having to put a structure in place, especially as the number of APIs grew from 10 to 50? As that evolved, like, how did you manage discoverability?
That's a great question. So in some ways, a business product and an API couldn't be further apart in terms of who understands them, right? So a lot of times you have the business person that owns the underlying business product. To use Michael's example, let's take a payments API. That business person knows everything about that payment rail, the rules, the risk factors, the monetization for it, the types of customers that would use it and what they use it for. Then you have an API expert who probably knows absolutely nothing about any of that. But if they built an API for it, they understand the nuts and the bolts of it. The problem is, if you go to that person for a description, they're going to go immediately to the nuts and bolts and describe it because that's what they understand. Whereas if you go to a product person, the payments products, they don't know anything about APIs. They might not even know how to spell API, right? So you need somebody that's in the middle. You need somebody that's what I would refer to as an API product manager, which is a bit of an odd skill set because it combines enough business acumen to be able to partner and know that they need to partner with the business line product team that owns the underlying capability that API is exposing, but then is technical enough and has enough experience with APIs to know what a good API design is and what it looks like. So generally what I advise the API product managers that I set up and install is for the marketing copy that goes in the portal, that's exactly what it needs to be. It needs to be marketing copy, not API information. It needs to be, what is this? Forget API. If you were to be in an elevator with someone and have to give them an elevator pitch on what this product allows you to do, you would explain, I need to send money. I need it to clear in 48 hours or less. I'm looking for low transaction fees and it's going to be domestic only, for example. That could be your use case. It's the business use case that the API solves. Once you have that, then you can start drilling down. So on the screen, if you think about it from a screen progression standpoint, at the top is elevator pitch you could explain to your next door neighbor. Then you scroll down and you start getting into the details. Well, is this one API that does this or is it three? What does each API do and in what order do I call? Okay, now scroll down a little further. Well, what data elements do I send in and what do I get back and so forth? So that would be my long-winded answer to the question.
Yeah. And even that third one, that data elements piece, I think for me, as a product person who don't have a background in engineering like you guys, I think I took a Java class in high school. So that's my level of technical proficiency. But if I end up having to look through a JSON format to understand the data elements, like I've gone too deep. And when you're doing the product strategy process, like that's such an important thing to understand of like, all right, if I make this call, what am I going to get back? And how can I start to incorporate that into my product? Or even things like the authentication flow. I'm sure a lot of people have needed to work with a Plaid or a Yodlee or an MX. Like understanding that part of the user experience and how it's going to flow and like visualizing that for a designer or a product person, like not an engineer, has such significant ramifications on the product strategy that really being able to bring that to life is helpful. And especially as a consulting company, sometimes the product people were being asked to evaluate 2 or 3 vendors against each other. And you can only get so much in a demo, but like going in there and saying like, oh, this person explained it to a non-technical audience really well. It just signifies a little of that quality of thought in the process there. Jeff, you mentioned another word, onboarding and DIY, which go hand in hand together a little bit, but you also worked for a big bank. So to talk about the trade-offs and how you balanced onboarding DIY with concerns about security and access management, what were the lessons learned? Like, how did you bring those worlds together?
Sure. So the golden rule for me on this topic has always been as much DIY as absolutely possible, everywhere possible. And to your point earlier about discoverability and being able to find things without getting help, the same thing applies to anything during the process of discovery, access request, integration, even production support. The more of that you can give to the developers or the product people that they can do themselves without asking for help, it's because asking for help slows you down. As you mentioned before, if I have to open up a ticket, I have no idea how long it's going to take. It could be days, it could be weeks. Usually SLAs aren't published. So the more DIY capabilities, it can be things like the documentation, requesting access, obtaining API keys, setting up OAuth configuration and tokens, MTLS certificate exchange. All of these things can generally be automated. And where the manual part comes in is you can have 2 types of manual assistance. You can have one where it's just purely manual. I'm opening a ticket, I'm getting help, I'm walking through something, or you can have a semi-manual process where the user is empowered to go in and do as much as they can and get as far as they can. Then to your point about security and risk and regulations, the company has to do something, but they do it on their end and push a button and it's automated and it sends a message back to the customer saying, this has been approved or your key has been generated. Here it is. So you can still insert that governance, KYC, know your customer. If you're a financial institution, you can still insert those things into the process.
Yeah. MG, curious your thoughts. You mentioned the console a little bit earlier. You mentioned documentation. We haven't said the sandbox word yet. As a developer, if you're going out and looking at an API, I'd love to just walk through like, how much are you reading versus watching videos versus like, how much do you want to just play around a little bit and explore? Like, what are you hoping to do and what do you expect to be able to do in 2024 if someone says, oh, I have an API developer portal?
I think you come in with a view of, okay, what problem am I trying to solve? And what, if any, familiarity do I have with this platform, with the API, with the problem set that I'm trying to solve? Because sometimes you come in and you've used, let's take payments, for example. Let's say I've used Stripe already, right? Well, I have a sense of how these payment APIs work. Therefore, if I'm looking at a payment APIs, now I'm coming in likely with a set of expectations. And so really it begins to become a mapping exercise. Hey, I know I could solve this problem this way over here. Can I quickly understand if I can solve those same problems here? Is this portal going to give me the same sort of capabilities and sort of understanding how quickly I can solve that problem? So some of it really is what's your starting point.
Yeah.
The other thing, the ability to get hands on keyboard to quickly understand how this works is really vital. Quite often we're in conversations and one of the questions I'm asked is, okay, how quickly can we get some code stood up, right? How quickly can we get a walking skeleton to prove out these concepts? And so this is where code is gold. And so our ability to quickly create a sandbox, stand up, show that we understand how these pieces connect is really vital. It gives the engineers and developers confidence. It gives the project team confidence in terms of our ability to solve the problem, in terms of the estimates we provided. And it also gives the client confidence as well.
Yeah. I think that's really key. I mean, thinking of some of the projects that have been more difficult with these third-party dependencies where, you probably know the one I'm talking about, where we're getting late in the game and we're still mocking certain endpoints. And like, we still don't have visibility into how this API is going to work and like a clear sense of that. And this is companies with potentially public documentation, but we can't get that level of clarity, just how much backloaded risk we have at that point because we haven't been able to do that integration. So one of the things that I think is really interesting that we've been using the developer portal term and always implying external developer platform or developer portal. Led myself there with the growth of internal development kind of platforms versus external developer portals. With the concepts like API catalog, it can be a little bit mushy of like what you're building for yourself, what you're building for your internal developers, what you're exposing externally, what's a marketplace versus monetization. So Jeff, I'd love you to break down, like when you think about, hey, we're building this internally for our developers in a large organization versus building externally, like what changes versus what's consistent and shared as you think about those different audiences?
Yeah. I mean, I think the easiest way to describe it would be bells and whistles. And that is that some of the bells, whistles, and then just the overall polish that you need for an external facing portal, you generally don't need for an internal portal. However, that being said, most of the bells, whistles, and polish that are applicable for an external portal are still appreciated by an internal developer as well. It's just that you don't need them. So if you're looking to try to build something and cost is a factor and time is a factor, then I guess they share the same number one thing, which is discoverability. So when companies are building internal portals, the number one reason they're doing this, really the root number one reason, is to avoid duplication. They're trying to avoid the same API getting created 100 different times by 100 different teams. That's both expensive, time consuming, and then you have this growing library of APIs, zombie APIs, et cetera, that you have to then spend money maintaining. It's harder to govern. So I would say putting even more focus on internal discoverability as opposed to on an external portal. If you have questions, there would be a ticketing system. Whereas in an internal portal, you can literally just show who is the lead developer or who is the product owner of this API. What's their email on the Active Directory or whatever. They can reach right out and ask them a question. Usually the types of volumes that you're going to get from an internal employee, even at a very large company, not going to be huge depending on what the API product is, of course, and how big the company is. But really just ensuring you have that catalog, ensuring you have the documentation, and ensuring you at least have the same type of base level description of what is this, what does it allow you to do. You're more looking at the developer persona for this as opposed to the external portal where you're looking at both the developer persona as well as the product owner, business person persona.
Yeah. It's funny because not having that, and we have like joint teams or Slack channels with a lot of our clients, like the ones that haven't had that, it's always, hey, where's the link to this API documentation again? Like, does this API exist? And it's a lot of like just back and forth in Slack and someone linking a Confluence page or something like that, or sending out a Word document and you end up with like version management and like no central kind of, it's a lot of manual processes to get people the right access and projects getting blocked there. So as you were going through that, I was thinking about all the folks that didn't have something like that we worked with. I guess picking up on that thread, since we've been doing this type of work, I think the ecosystem's changed a lot. And one of the things that I think we're seeing is some of the tooling catching up to the demands of the market versus these being these big customized initiatives. So MG, I'd be curious over the last 5, 6, 7 years, and I know you've been talking to some folks about the platform side of this, like what's changed in terms of what's gotten easier, I guess, about having a developer portal, whether internal or external from that perspective?
I think the first thing really is APIs previously have been seen as this utility, right? Yes, we need APIs to provide integration to connect. Whereas today that's moved towards understanding this as part of a developer experience, right? So this goes to all the points that we've been making about there's a search, there's thought about product and organizing the content in the way that encourages discoverability, being able to find those things. So a real understanding that the developer experience and creating a place for developers to easily interact, find these APIs is really pretty key. So that's definitely one. I think we talked about versioning's come up a couple of times in this conversation. And so when you think about versioning, especially externally, having the appropriate API lifecycle management, versioning, clearly articulating those things is really paramount. And so we're seeing much more focus on companies providing and products providing this out of the box. And then the third thing I'll say really is around understanding that APIs are not an endpoint in and of themselves, but that they actually foster ecosystem. You have companies that have put APIs out there that have customers that are utilizing those APIs in ways that they never imagined, right? And so that spawns this innovation, this ecosystem. In many ways, it's actually like customers are doing that. Well, we hadn't thought about that. What does that mean for our roadmap? What does that mean for our community engagement? And what other information do we want to know from these folks? And so I think that is probably something that we didn't see 5 or 6 years ago, thinking about APIs in that way. But that's something definitely showing up today.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point because I've had that conversation with some clients before of who are we building for, right? And like, are we building for enterprise adoption of these APIs, or are we building these APIs for the proverbial guy in the garage type of thing that has an idea and wants to do something? And it's always interesting because you kind of have to do both because the development community, it is a community. And the right person using the right API to do something really cool that's documentation, and then they're talking about it on Stack Overflow or something like that, like they could be the ones that are bringing that up to the executives at the company they look at because they had a great experience with it, or they did something new, or they learned something about it to help drive that enterprise adoption of those types of APIs and services. And so there's always been a big component of open source projects and collaboration and kind of people spending their time on these things. So I think it's really interesting to think about like, yes, most of this is going to be enterprise and that's who I'm going to charge and that's going to be the kind of the costing structure. But thinking about who are those early adopters going to be that can help tell a story. Again, probably less about payments APIs because we know everyone needs payments APIs here. But there's other examples that I think are these more emergent and innovative areas. And I think with that, Jeff, that kind of guides to a next question of metrics, observability. What are the things that you are always watching for and you were trying to look at to understand like, okay, what's going on with both my APIs, but my portal, but also my customer? Like, what were you watching for? What were you alerting on? And how did that generate insights of like, okay, something's going on here that could be good, or something going on here that, hey, this might be bad. Like we're seeing a drop in this.
I'll start with the one that was least obvious and then go into the most obvious. So one to look out for is API bundles. So you usually hear what the customer ultimately is looking to accomplish, but sometimes some customers, especially the ones that focus mostly on DIY, they don't have a lot of questions. They're able to find out what they need. They request access to the APIs and you give it to them. You start looking for patterns in which APIs are used together. And this can give insights into what people are doing with them if you don't have another means of finding that out because you're servicing just an incredibly large amount of customers who are onboarding nonstop. It's easier, smaller operations because you're having more direct conversations with the customers to understand what they're doing. So that would be one. And then the other thing is just base metrics around how many users are coming and looking at your documentation and products, API product marketing page, versus how many are requesting access versus how many are being granted versus denied access. And then if they're denied, what is the reason behind that? Usually it's the business line product owner who's making that type of decision on who to do business with or not for whatever reason. And then beyond that, just the actual volume. How many customers are calling which API, how many times a day? What are the response times? What is the error response versus success response? You can get a lot of indications about that, both not just in terms of the API reliability, but how well the user is using it, because there are many different error scenarios where it's because the user is sending in bad data. that can be very useful. And then if you have integrated support ticketing in your portal, which I highly recommend, I mean, that to me is table stakes. If you can't have integrated support into the portal, I would almost be so bold as to say you shouldn't have a portal to begin with. But all the metrics around the ticketing, which customers are asking the most questions, how long is that taking, what are your support SLAs, is the operations team providing the support, meeting those SLAs, all of those things should be analyzed.
You brought up support a couple times, and obviously you endorsed it strongly there, to say the least. As you were maintaining a large developer portal, like what were the most common types of support requests that you were getting? Who owned responding to those? What was the support structure needed to support the running and the day-to-day, the rhythm of the business of a developer portal? I'd just love to hear your experience and what you learned over the years on that.
It's a fantastic question because it's a very shockingly difficult problem to solve, okay? Because there's really three people who could provide the support. There's the product team, not the API product team, but the business product team that owns the core business product that is now being exposed as an API, assuming it was exposed as something else previously. That's one. They're not the best because they generally don't understand APIs. Then you've got the default solution, which is what most companies go with, which is whatever engineering team built the APIs, those are the ones who support it. That can work, but the problem is a solid API engineer is an expensive resource and also likely assigned to be building additional API capabilities. Adding an unknown amount and volume of support to their backlog is going to reduce predictive delivery on their new API builds or their API enhancements. So you really don't want them doing the support because as your customer base grows, so does the volume of support. And it can get down to the point where you literally have very quickly a full-time job for an API developer doing nothing but support. Then the third is any operations help desk. But at many companies, an operations help are more catered to web users, mobile users who are not very technical. It's more in the traditional call center type of scenario. So the most success I've had at multiple companies, all the way down to measuring success by collecting and reporting on customer satisfaction scores, specific not just to the API program, but to the support and assistance they receive. You really need a specialized team of API support personnel. And these are people who are not API developers, but they're a step away from API developers. They're close to API developers. They may not be able to build an API, but they can definitely call one in Postman. They can definitely call one in SOAP UI. I typically find these folks oftentimes working as QA testers for API products at other companies, and they're looking to level up to the next step. And what you do is you build out a team of API support experts who over time learn the API products that you have and become experts at them. And to directly answer the question that you asked about the types of questions, it's very specific to, I'm calling this API. I'm trying to do this. I've read the documentation. I'm not sure this is exactly the use case I should be doing. What should I be sending in this field? It says this, but maybe it's not taking it. Very API product, but technical specific questions. And those API support people are the best ones to answer it. And one customer I surveyed, they said it best. They said, I want my API people talking to your API people. And that's great, but I don't want them talking to my API developers because they're busy. So you have this separate team to focus on this.
Yeah. I mean, we're going to talk about AI a little bit later, but anytime we hear support, like what role can AI potentially play there is interesting. But as we're doing our kind of modern product work with a lot of companies, you hit on the fundamental tension. And it's this tension between the you build it, you own it movement versus the how do we optimize our most expensive people? And you hit on it there of like, do you want someone with 10, 15 years experience picking up help desk tickets because they know the API the best? And I think that's one of the things companies struggle most with between kind of build and run and like those two paradigms that have inherent tension. And so I really like the elegance of that solution of it's not just someone taking tickets and answering phones, but it's not your most senior engineer. It's these QA folks. And if you worked with really strong kind of QA team members, they are in Postman, they are looking at verifying that, they are running those tests, they know how to test them, they understand the underpinnings of them. A lot of them have kind of development talent and they understand the engineering as well. And so it is a very elegant solve for that. Just before we cut to the second half and we start talking about governance and operational models for this, I guess a question, MG, I'll come to you first. Someone's looking at starting out a dev portal journey, or they're partway through one that isn't going as they had hoped. What advice would you have for them right now?
I think that there's a theme that's been running in my head for the last couple of months, is that the fundamentals have never been more fundamental, right? And so as we think about APIs, the first is, are you grounded in understanding solid API design, right? Have you spent the time in understanding that? At this point, there is a ton of documentation, a lot of great examples out there. So have you spent time in rooting yourself and understanding that, right? We've mentioned Stripe and others several times. I think the other piece that has been highlighted here is if you're going to step a portal, make sure that you're leaning into developer experience, right? Because discoverability, building the documentation that is going to allow people to understand what the APIs are, what they do, how they work, it's just critical. So these fundamentals are there. And then in today's world, security needs to be foundational and thinking about that from day one, because it is really difficult to go back after the fact and try to make sure that you add it in. You're likely to miss something. And so I'd say make sure that you're thinking about that.
Jeff, any thoughts on your side for advice you'd offer someone starting on this journey?
Yeah, I'd say the biggest thing, to link it back to the primary goal of the portal, the number one goal is that discoverability. And so I would strongly advise a CMS to be employed, because you don't want to have to publish a portal every time you want to update content on it, add an API, et cetera. Make sure that within that CMS, you build a framework that's specifically around tagging to make searching better. Ensure that the documentation can be uploaded and imported and indexed properly, both for manual user searches as well as then later for AI capabilities, which we'll get into a little bit of next. Ticketing, as I've said before, for everything from acquisition phase to access request, onboarding, integration assistance, and production support, and long-term steady state operations. And then built-in sandbox capability, also very important for the reasons that you both mentioned earlier.
I love the concept we have here of things to consider, like, are you ready for maintaining and the cost? And the idea of like, hey, if you don't have someone lined up to write all the documentation, probably don't start this. If you don't have a service team set up to handle support tickets, don't start this. And yep. I think the cool thing about the documentation is, if done well, you could do that first. You can roll that out and test it. For those that are familiar with the Amazon method, they do the press release FAQ. And talked to someone once and they said, sometimes we took it a little too far, but they would actually sometimes for a new API, they would write a press release for it, which is the idea of what we're talking about to it, right? Like, how would you sell that API? And that's something that if you sit down for a couple of hours with a group of people, you can write that press release. And if you don't have a good story, if you can't articulate it, you're going to struggle on the back end, because eventually you're going to have to tell that story to somebody and be able to do that. And I think whether it's developer portals or internal development platforms or design systems component libraries, I think on the onset, they seem really fun to people sometimes. Oh, I'm going to get to go through and I'm going to get to rationalize all of our APIs. I'm going to get to clean up all of the tech debt and the mess, and it's going to be this logical and ordered system, and it's all going to connect. And they seem really fun at first, because it seems like development work and API engineering and ordering things and getting it all to a consistent framework. But it's a documentation and project management like it's a lot of work on the back end to be able to do that. And so I think just not underestimating that. That being said, I do think there are tools that have that built-in CMS functionality, that have that built-in tagging functionality that can make a lot of that easier and structure your thinking versus 5-6 years ago, you were looking at starting from scratch, basically, every time to be able to do these. So I think that's the thing that you can start to take advantage to be able to do that.
Thank you for joining us on Build What's Next, Digital Product Perspectives. If you would like to know more about how Method can partner with you and your organization, you can find more information at method.com. Also, don't forget to follow us on social and be sure to check out our monthly Tech Talks. You can find those on our website. And finally, make sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss out on any future episodes. We'll see you next time.